Welcome to the Station Buildings webinar. It's so lovely to see so many of you here. There's around 55 of you joining us this morning, which is absolutely brilliant. My name's Brian Barnsley. I'm Head of Support and Development at Community Rail Network, and I'm joined today by the disembodied voice of Hazel Lavery, and my colleague from the south, Dan, and he will be looking out for the technical stuff. If you have an issue, he will try and pick that up for you. So Dan's down there. It'll also help answer some of the questions. We're joined by quite a few members of Community Rail Network staff in the audience as well, so no doubt they'll be happy to chip in. I think you've already heard the conversation about recording. We are now being recorded. That is purely for educational use, so we can actually put it on the website and use it elsewhere. I think most of you will be used to using Zoom or whatever these days. So if you would mind making sure your audio is off and your video is off while we're talking, that would be really helpful. If you're invited to speak, if you have a question, please, we'll switch you on, so there's no problem there. If you haven't renamed, it's useful if we have the right names on the system. I've had at least one Daffy Duck on one of these in the past, which does make it a bit difficult to know who you're talking to. So if you haven't renamed, have a look at that. That'll be useful. The chat section, the chat function is working. If you've got questions or thoughts, pop them in the chat. Again, Dan and Hazel are keeping an eye on the chat to see what's happening, and we can use some of those questions later. Technical issues I've missed, done already. Feedback, there will be an online survey that will pop up at the end. It's really helpful if you can fill that in. It really does help us plan our future things and plan how we do stuff. So feedback is incredibly important. So I'm really pleased to be here hosting this. I'm not going to rabbit on much longer. So I think what we'll do is we will go to our first couple of speakers, if that's okay. And start off before the break, we have Tim Headley-Jones from the Railway Heritage Trust, who are a truly fantastic organisation. They have loads and loads of money to do really interesting stuff. And followed by Bob Larman from Network Rail, who leads property at Network Rail Central and, I always get this wrong, Central and Northwest. And he's going to talk about station buildings and issues from his perspective. So with no further ado, Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Brian. That's great. I'll just share my screen now. So hopefully everyone can see that now. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about...
Tim, the screen's... Oh, there we go. Got it.
You got it?
Just pinged up, yeah.
Good. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. The eye test for everyone is that this is Glen Eagles in Scotland, one of our previous projects we helped to restore. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and focus on three key things, really. What the key criteria are for the trust to be able to give a grant, how our grant award scheme works, and really looking at how heritage projects can be sustainable projects and help to really drive the sustainability of station buildings. Just before I go into that, though, first of all, just a very quick slide on who we are and where we came from. Well, we were created in 1985 by sort of mutual agreement between British Rail and Heritage campaigners, really as a result of two particular campaigns. One was around the Euston Arch at the top, that top picture, which was unsuccessful in saving it, and the picture at the bottom, which is St Pancras, where it was successful in saving it, and we all know what a beautiful station that now is. So that's really where we came from. We're an independent company with a board of directors. One of the myths is that we're not a charity. We're not part of Network Rail, so we are a sort of self-standing independent organisation, but we do receive all our funding from Network Rail and a small component from the National Highways for grants to the Historical Railways estate, and we cover the whole of England, Scotland, and Wales. In terms of what we cover, you know, this is the list. I'm not going to read it out, but basically it's everything, including the kitchen sink. I would add that there is one new item to add to this list, and that's artillery shells. So we are potentially looking at restoring a historic artillery shell in Aberdeen. But broadly, as long as it's a structure and it's to do with the railway, then we can help. The one area we can't help with is track, so we don't do track. In terms of really how we add value, well, we award grants to projects. We've awarded just over 1,900 since 1985. So the value of about £65 million. But the key factor really is that that's helped to draw in £84 million of other funding that's been invested in the UK's railways. So that's really where we help to add value. And then the second area is really around being able often to make the first commitment to fund a project. And that helps to draw out other funding sources. In terms of the key criteria, this is really sort of important sort of slide. And apologies that there's a fair bit of writing on it, but it probably just helps just to focus on these particular areas. We support projects which support the restoration and/or reuse of listed buildings or structures, or buildings or structures which are in conservation areas and which are owned by Network Rail. So the key fact of us is that we really work with Network Rail's assets. So it's often sort of difficult for us to work with heritage railways which have no longer part of the Network Rail network. That's not a sort of a list which is static. So, for example, Water Orton Station near Birmingham has recently become part of a conservation area and is therefore coming now within our remit, and we're talking to the community group there and with Network Rail about how we can help support the restoration of that particularly beautiful station. So buildings do become part of conservation areas. So if you're in a group where your station isn't one of those parts, then potentially you could work with the local authority potentially to include it in a conservation area, for example. We also do quite a lot of projects with a company called the Arch Company, which you may have heard of. They took over a very long lease on Network Rail's arches a couple of years ago, and they are now managing that estate, hopefully bringing back into use quite a lot of redundant assets. And they don't just own railway arches or work with railway arches, they also own station buildings. So, for example, Rain Hill is a particularly important station in terms of railway history, and we're working with the local parish council there on a potential community project to bring redundant space back into use. So Archco very much partners of ourselves, and they are very much part of the remit of the areas that we can cover. As I said earlier, we can also support projects which are on or part of the National Highways Historical Railways estate. And these are really assets that were formerly owned by the British Railways Board. So back in sort of probably about 10 years ago, it was decided to disband the British Railways Board, and the only pan-national transport body into which these railway assets could be passed was actually National Highways. So slightly ironical that National Highways are actually dealing with former railway assets. So we do give grants for there. One of our biggest projects to one of these assets owned by the National Highways Historic Railways estate is the Benelli Viaduct, which hopefully many of you may have seen on social media. It opened officially for the first time earlier this year, and is now a key sort of linking up of cycle routes in the area and just near Nottingham. So it's on the border with Derbyshire. So it's a really amazing structure. Do recommend visiting it. There are a few areas that we don't cover. So our focus is on the structures and the buildings themselves. Areas that we can't cover are design fees, architects' fees, or contingency funds, and we don't pay VAT. So those are the key sort of areas that we can't work with. And then in terms of how much we're able to offer, you know, as I say, our funding is relatively small in terms of our annual budget, but generally we're able to give around 40% of the heritage costs of a project. So we can't really help to fund equipment or fittings, but you know, the structure of the building, you know, restoration, for example, of windows, or replacing modern doors with heritage doors, for example, are exactly the sort of areas that we work with. So those hopefully are the sort of simple sort of view of what our key criteria are for supporting projects. And then just moving on in terms of how our projects work. So really, there are only 2 of us in the Rail Heritage Trust, so we can't actually deliver projects ourselves. So we rely on, you know, all the great people out there, many of you on the call today, who are delivering projects or looking to deliver projects. And really, you know, we come in when there's a need for funding. So we like to sort of get involved at the start of a project, and if it's one that we can support, we will say that we'll support it in principle. So that's a, you know, that's a pretty firm commitment from ourselves that it comes within our remit and we can give a grant for it. So then, you know, in many ways, you know, part of the process is then for that project to be developed by whichever organisation we're working with, and that could be a company, it could be a train company, it could be a community group, it could be a charity, and then it's for them really to sort of develop their business plan. Clearly, liaison with the relevant train company and or Network Rail is really critical, and I'm sure that will be a subject for discussion later within the webinar. But you know, when sort of costs, indicative timescales, project plans are sort of known, then that's the point at which people generally tend to re-engage with ourselves, and then we can look at what the project is and which elements are suitable for us to fund, and then we then make an offer in writing of a grant award, and it's a relatively six-page application form. It's a relatively unbureaucratic process. We can turn around an application in around a week. So you know, compared to perhaps some other grant bodies, we are relatively fleet of foot and able to really sort of make that first step. So that's really how the putting in place the grant award works. And then you know, the project lead fills out an application form. We issue a grant award letter, and then, you know, the full words there, the project is delivered. You know, probably takes a huge amount of time, probably lots of effort, and obviously Barbara is on the webinar a bit later. She has the experience of delivering projects like this, and it is certainly far more complicated than 4 words on a PowerPoint slide. But on completion, then you know, we like to see evidence either through architect certificates, or we really like to visit projects to see evidence of completion. The project lead then submits an invoice, and then we can pay on completion of the project. Now, this next sort of point is really the critical one for us, is that we can actually carry over liabilities for projects which have not been completed into following financial years, because we recognise that projects can be delayed by forces outside the control of those delivering them, and this really does help to ensure the stability of projects over potentially multiple years, when sometimes, you know, people are up against financial years where funding is only available. So we like to be able to be slightly more flexible about that. And then the really final point is, you know, we are here for advice on any aspect of railway heritage, any aspect of our grant award process, and very much there to really sort of support projects that are dealing with you know, perhaps train companies that they're not familiar with. Perhaps Network Rail is often, you know, a big organisation to try and work with. So it is important for us to you know, be there to provide advice, to help sort of unblock things, and really to be your support throughout a project. And then just really, you know, the final topic I just want to cover, you know, in the final 5 minutes of this presentation is really you know, how we support heritage through sustainable projects. And this phrase, I really like this phrase, recognising what we have is at the heart of sustainable change. And that for me is really important in terms of assessing our heritage assets and really understanding what we have. And, you know, for example, the photograph here is one where we're working with Network Rail in Coventry of a very simple tunnel portal, pedestrian tunnel portal, which really, you know, people have stopped recognizing what we have here. This is a beautiful early 19th century tunnel portal, very artistically, very fine decoration, but the fencing's in the wrong place, the graffiti is awful, the vegetation is starting to destroy it, and it really needs a helping friend. So we're working with Coventry Historic Trust to and Network Rail to get the fencing back, to clean up the portal, and to help people recognise the significance of this beautiful asset. And then, you know, really just sort of put this very recent photograph up of Lydd Town Station, destroyed by fire last Monday. This station was not listed, it was not in a conservation area, it was not still owned by the railway. And, you know, I think it's a salutary reminder to us that in many ways, Network Rail provides a fantastic support to railway projects. And when railway structures leave the asset base of the railway, then their future can sometimes be rather sort of on a knife edge. And here at Lydd, you know, the community here has lost not an architecturally outstanding building, not an historically important building, but certainly a building of local significance that could have been repurposed for a really suitable future use. And so I think it's really you know, disappointing that the fact that it was empty has meant that it was open to arson and has now been destroyed and probably will need to be actually demolished. And that, I think, is a real shame. So, you know, we really do want to keep buildings, you know, really used. We want to see reuse happening, and that's the purpose really of our grants. And you know, we want to see buildings kept in operational, well, in potentially community use, operational use, or new commercial use. An example of where that's been really successful is at Ladybank in Scotland, where the upper photograph shows what it looked like in 2010, an empty building, nothing going on in it, everything boarded up, no historical features visible. And then below, 2022, this year, that building now has an operating therapy centre and is a really great community facility that's there for the community. The rest of the station has 2 artists in residence. ScotRail themselves have funded the restoration of a waiting room in that structure. So this is really a great success story where buildings in stations, which, you know, this station has very low footfall. It's a very small village. Ladybank is not a big community, but yet these buildings have a future use. And when Network Rail, train companies, Railway Heritage Trust, and individuals and organisations with vision get together, then the results can be absolutely astounding. So Ladybank, a real success story. And then just, you know, one of our future projects, I'd like to leave you really sort of with one that we want to sort of continue the good work of the trust going forward, is at Gorebridge. And this has application to that example of Lydd, in that this was actually sold off by the railway. Network Rail actually sold it off. It then became abandoned. It used to be a pub, but it's now back in Network Rail ownership. We're working with the community group to turn this into a community shop and flexible office space and a holiday let above. This beautiful building, early 1840s, is hopefully going to have a great future on the Borders Railway. So I think there's a real opportunity for the trust to work with organisations to deliver sustainable projects and really help communities to bring their station buildings back into better use. I'll leave my details are there. We're very easy to find on social media. Our website gives us details. That's my email address and my phone number. I'm sure Hazel and Hannah will be able to, and Brian will be able to give my details if anyone's interested and don't have my details. I'd really like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to hand over now to Rob.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thanks very much, Tim. That was really interesting. I think I'll have a few questions for you as well. I'm sure others do too. So as you've heard, repurposing disused property assets to rejuvenate railway environments and create local social impact is really well documented within Network Rail, the Department for Transport and train operators, and all those groups that come together to make that possible. And there's some amazing examples out there. But to me, the long process that groups seem to have to go through to secure those rights in the first place could at times perhaps be seen as though they're hurdles designed to sift out only the most tenacious. So well done for those that have been through the process, and hopefully we can learn from your experiences. We need to be honest about some of those barriers as well, so that we can change things ourselves to become a bit more welcoming to groups that are seeking to make changes within our estate. I think the first step is for me to give some insights into how it is within Network Rail, not least to forearm interested groups. Do so in a way that's unified with train operators and learn from your experiences. And that will allow us to become a bit more strategic and a bit more efficient in how we leverage that local input into the estate to maintain the buildings and the communities that can benefit from them. So today I'm going to refer specifically to leases directly from Network Rail, rather than through the franchised estate. Perhaps I'll leave that topic for next time. I'll just bring up my screen. Here we go. So the first thing to remember when dealing with Network Rail is that we are split into 5 regions. So it's really important to get hold of the right contacts in the first place. Within those regions, each one is split into a route, and often the best point of contact in the first instance can be if there is a community lead within that route. So I work in the Northwest, which is this green section here, and those are the community leads in the Northwest. But if you're not sure, search the website or there's a contact us page. The next thing you can check in order to get hold of the right person in the first place, as Tim mentioned, is to ensure that it wasn't one of the assets that were disposed of to Archco. Access to land registry is free and the map search is free, and you'll be able to see which assets have been let on a long leasehold basis to the Archco company through your search on land registry. That might help you just to get in touch with the right people in the first instance, where it may seem as if it's a railway asset, but actually the controlling interest is held by a third-party company. However, I'm really pleased to hear through Tim that they are open to working with community groups. I'd love to see that how that progresses. The element that's a little bit harder to get hold of is who in Network Rail or who in the train operator to talk to. You can't often tell from land registry as to whether the asset is part of what we call the franchise station estate, or whether it's not part of the actual the lease that we've granted to the train operators, but it's part of Network Rail sort of unencumbered freehold, in which case you'll need to deal directly with Network Rail within the application. However, the input with the train operator, given the sort of operating environment that we're talking about, is going to be key throughout. So whether you go via the train operator or Network Rail, it probably doesn't matter. The key thing is to get hold of the right people as early on as you can. So who are those people? Well, in addition to the communities lead, I'd suggest trying to track down who we would consider to be the building asset owner, which can be tricky. There's building engineers that are responsible for most of the line side estate within Network Rail, and they're often the right person to try to get hold of via the communities lead. You'd also benefit from someone from commercial property. That's my colleagues in the asset management team of commercial property who can manage the leases in conjunction with the asset owner. Asset protection is no doubt a word that you've heard. They're a team of engineers that make sure that whatever works are happening on and near the railway are done in a safe manner. And of course, you need the train operator. There's some additional people that you might need to get involved as well. We have sponsors, which are a bit like a route client, if you like, on behalf of our route businesses. Maintenance delivery units often can become involved, particularly on elements of land. Station portfolio surveyor, they're the interface between Network Rail and the train operator. And Archco interface, we have people that manage the relationship with Archco. I'm going to talk specifically about leases about buildings, subject of today. And there's a lot more detail that would go into a lease for a building as opposed to a license, which is quite quick. So a license can typically be terminated at any point in time, and it's not so much detail probably needs to go into a license for, say, maintaining the environment outside a building as it would taking on a building itself. And there's a few key differences that I've noticed with typical commercial leases and leases that are genuinely designed or generally should be with the intention of helping the community group or the local enterprise to thrive in that environment. Take the picture on the right, and it's not specific to here, but you can look at where the beams of the station canopy abut the building here. So if that building was let on a full repairing and insuring basis to the tenant, almost by default, the tenant might unaware become liable for some of the elements of repair and maintenance that actually form part of where the station canopy abuts. And that was never really the intention of the parties at the time, but these little bits of detail are really important to think through. Other things such as how we're going to maintain the windows and who's going to undertake the works of each section. In a commercial environment, you offer an internal repairing or full repairing insuring lease, and it's largely the commercial decision of the parties at the time, who are largely advised by their own professional lawyers, land agents, etc. And sometimes those mistakes are largely a commercial mistake. But the kind of thing we're talking about here is never intended for that to be the case. So we've got to get into the detail quite early on. Macro level challenges for us. Well, we don't have dedicated resources to letting assets for community rail or active travel or sort of non-commercial reasons. The way that we've historically been set up is not necessarily the way we should be set up going forward. It sort of targets us more towards our financial incentive and doesn't really allow for a lot of the softer impacts, the social impact, the environmental impact, etc., to be taken into account. Got a lot of competing demands as well internally, as you can imagine, householders, local authorities, cycle interest groups, as well as our own sort of internal railway requirements that give a lot of competing demands on what is often quite a small property team. And that might be why at times you think you've got somewhere, but it might be a few months have passed, but that's just the way that sort of a person is pushed and pulled around with the demands in front of them. And even internally, we've got stakeholders and silos and to negotiate, and it can, if I'm honest, be difficult sometimes to find the right person even internally. What has happened in the last few years though is devolution and property becoming part of the routes and regions themselves. So whilst we're still perhaps bedding into that, I think over time it will become a lot more unified in our approach, and certainly in the Northwest, and I'm sure that's the case for other regions, that's the way we need to get to. We also would like to see our reporting and targets change a little bit. It's a very strange thing to say, asking for different targets and different reporting. So we can make more of a point around the impact that all of your groups make. And also we need to build up our asset knowledge. All of these things lead to sometimes a little bit of inconsistency. There's some fantastic examples, and there's some examples that have been a bit harder to come to fruition, no doubt. So the good news is that there are some great people. Once you find them, typically can come from all shapes and sizes across all different teams. So get hold of the right people, and that will stand us in good stead. Now, I'm not going to read all of these out, but when we first get an inquiry in, a lot of questions come up, and they could relate to whether the application, for example, is just the first application. Is that the right use for that building? Have we got a long-term plan for that building that may just be sitting there in a fairly mundane state, not really causing anyone any significant concern of risk of safety, etc., relative to other assets, structures, drainage, etc., that we also have to maintain. But also, if we grant a lease, which is a legal right, a legal obligation to an entity, is that entity able to maintain and look after that building? Now, I've no doubt that you're extremely enthusiastic and have the right levels of competence, but I guess we find it hard, perhaps sometimes, to know that is the case from the outset. A little bit of decision making guidance internally would probably help us a long way towards that. For example, where a building is of unknown structural condition, our asset knowledge sometimes is not that detailed when it comes to looking at local assets. The benefit is often local groups and local people can often have better asset knowledge than we do in some of the cases. So being open about what you know and what precisely what the plans are can really help us in the long term to come to a lease agreement that is appropriate for the asset and for the use that you have in mind. Now, I won't dwell on all of these, but some tips that I thought of that might help. So, as I said at the start, find the right people. And I think a combination of those that I mentioned at the start would be a good starting point. Be clear on the intended use. So I know that it is important for, where possible, for revenue to be generated from the use of the asset itself in order to keep the asset genuinely sustainable and to maintain the activities on site and the condition of the building. But it also might bring up planning use changes, particularly if there's multi-uses involved. So just be clear up front around that and whether there's any subletting proposed or licensing proposed within the building itself as a sub-activity to some of the core undertaking of the vision. Expect some structural and safety concerns. Probably will need a structural and condition survey, which will largely inform the costings and may inform the funding that you have available to you or what you're going to apply for. So we probably need, with asset protection, and this is where involving a lot of different teams within Network Rail is tricky, but it's what we need to do and to get access to professionals to assess what the building is like in order so you can apply for the right grants and finalise the business case. You need to work out how it can be maintained over time and the funding for that. Practicality is also key. Things like utilities. Can we sever them from the station? Is a sub-metering agreement going to be acceptable with the train operator? Can we put a new supply in? A lot of these things we just don't often know at the start, which, you know, and then they're little bits that perhaps come up through different conversations with different people over time, and it's quite piecemeal perhaps. We also benefit from a clearly marked plan and any sort of access and parking that might be needed. In terms of the lease itself, now leases have what we call a term certain, which is the length of time that you have certainty to occupy that building. Now, normally we'd have a break right if the railway needed that asset for any point in time for its operational undertaking or an emergency, for example. But we need to know what the funders' minimum requirements are as well, if there's a 10-year term for them to get a return, if that's applicable, and anything else. So the earlier we know these things, the sooner we can start to put them on paper and come up with some heads of terms together. Within that, knowing what the legal constitution is as well. I've noticed a couple of examples talking to colleagues where clarifying whether it's a charity, it's a group of individuals that are incorporated, it's a trust, it's, you know, we benefit from knowing these things so we know where the liability sits. And some of these assets are indeed, you know, you could argue that they are liabilities, so we just need to be careful that the group or the legal structure is appropriate for the asset itself and the condition that it's in. Another example is one underway at the moment at Bricket Wood, where I'm hoping we've learned some of these things. Talking to the person involved, yes, it's been a process. We want to write down what those things are so we can learn and develop and go from there. And the structure that's been arrived at in a couple of examples recently, and apologies, this has got quite a few words on it, is largely this, a rough roadmap, if you like. So are you talking to the right people, and what's the business model here? How is it going to prove to us it's going to be sustainable over time and create the most impact? And then we need to come together in the railway industry and ascertain whether there's a strategic fit. Is it a go or no go point in time here? Have all the relevant key stakeholders agreed, yes, we support this in principle, a bit like what Tim was saying with the approval in principle there. I feel like that step would be quite useful for groups at as an earlier stage as possible after a little bit of information gathering, so you know where you stand. The structure that has been, I think, at two sites recently, which are midway, is what we've got an agreement for lease, and it's where the physical works are undertaken under an agreement for lease, which means that once those works have been done to the satisfaction of asset protection, the train operator and us, etc., at that point a lease is triggered, and that's when the benefit of the right to use the property is entered into. And that structure also allows for the funders to have certainty that, subject to planning permission, for example, subject to X, Y, and Z, that a lease will be granted, and that maybe gives a little bit more certainty to the group and all those invested in it that there is light at the end of the tunnel. It does mean that a lot of pre-contractual work has to happen, which is the detail, and I know that's where it is tricky, and there are an awful lot of stakeholders internally and externally to navigate. And what you end up being, I suppose, and I'm keen to hear your experiences, is effectively a project manager of all of those various people, because all of those different stakeholders, in whether it's in Network Rail or maybe the train operator, sometimes have their own sort of remit involved, and they're not necessarily able to project manage it from internally, and that's actually where a dedicated resource would really help us, to help you bring the projects through to fruition. A couple of terms that you've probably heard if you've been through the process, but one of them is clearance, which is effectively an internal approval in principle to proceed. There's two stages of that. And the other one is a license condition 17, which is the way we're regulated from the Office for Rail and Road. It just governs how we can dispose of assets to make sure they're not going to have an adverse effect on the operation of the railway. But the great news is I don't think there's much conflict with here. I'm going to have to finish now, but I think these slides are going to be shared. I had some personal thoughts on things that we can do internally, which I can see Brian smiling to his delight there. They will take time, but I think, as I said at the start, the starting point is for us to be honest about it, about how things work, and be open to listening from your experiences, so that we can perhaps better improve the process and make it a little bit more efficient for everyone concerned. So I'll hand back to Brian now. Thank you very much, and look forward to your questions later.
Right, it is time for questions now. While you're thinking about it, because no one's got their hand up at the moment, just one small point. Tim made an interesting point about funding and what the Railway Heritage Trust couldn't fund. From our point of view, with our Community Rail Development Fund, particularly if you're on or part of a accredited community rail partnership, we can fund solicitors' fees, we can fund design costs, and more importantly, we can fund feasibility studies. Now, we've done a couple of these this year, and actually I suspect we've saved both groups a significant amount of money, because having done the feasibility study, we discovered drains were an issue in the particular case I'm thinking of. In fact, well, they weren't an issue, they weren't there. So there was no point putting a toilet in, for instance, into this building on an island platform if you can't actually get the brown water away at all. So it's really important that we present to the industry, Community Rail presents to the industry projects that perhaps not oven ready, but certainly we've got a pretty shrewd idea how they can work. And I think sometimes from our point of view, we don't always do that as well as we ought to, although that doesn't apply to every project, of course. So I would say, yes, CRDF can actually fund some of these things, this pre-work, which will help people move further down the line. Great, we have a question from Scotland. Hi, Wooly, hi. Can we switch him on?
Yep, good morning,
yeah,
all.
Hello, mate.
Hi there. Just speaking on Rob, I get all the stuff that you were saying there, but you make it sound very, very daunting. My experience of it, and we've got lots of experience in Scotland of bringing derelict or disused buildings back into use, mainly with the help of Railway Heritage Trust and Andy Savage. We've never really had the issues that you've mentioned. That I think that mainly means if you go direct to Network Rail, but in Scotland, most of them go through the talk, go through ScotRail, who have got a very good team in place for dealing with things like this. And they've got their contacts at Network Rail. So they do the group never actually contacts Network Rail. Everything's done through the talk. The design and the project management part of it, that always gets taken on board by the architects who are in place. So the architect provides the project funding, the project support. They project manage it. It goes to tender for the company, and the companies are all registered with ScotRail anyway, so they all know what they're supposed to do on railway. The only issue really that the community groups have got with the Network Rail side of it is the high fees, the landlord fees and the super landlord fees. They can be quite high and quite daunting, and sometimes they come out of the blue and have not been budgeted for, so the groups are rushing about scurrying for trying to find these extra fees. So maybe that's something that they could maybe Network Rail could look at, as maybe lowering the fees a wee bit and making the fees more sort of suitable to community groups. Thanks very much. It's been very informative so far.
Thanks,
that's great, Woody. That's a super comment. It's good to hear that. You know, don't mean to sound it daunting. The point being that you've got hold of the right people, I suppose, from the outset in terms of the ScotRail being on board, etc. And that's really good to hear. I think there are some great examples out there, and if you know what the process is to follow, it sounds like it's completely doable.
Yeah. The other thing that we do in Scotland is we use sort of past experience. People that's been through the process before will advise other people who are ready to go through the process. So they tell them what the pitfalls may be, what to look for, and what to make sure you've got in place before you approach anyone.
Yeah. Cheers, Woody. Julie's got a hand up, and then Tim.
Yeah, just to say, lucky you in Scotland. It's very different in England. You'll find out later when I talk.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, I think take the point, Willie, and I think it does help. When you can work through a train company. I mean, the example that I gave of Gorebridge, that actually is not within the operating lease of ScotRail, and so that project will be done through Network Rail. So yeah. I think it's sort of horses for courses. It's not necessarily everything in Scotland goes through ScotRail. There are different examples of other projects where they do need to go through Network Rail. And the point I think made just then by Julie is really important. Is about visiting people who've done it before. So someone like Alan Brown at Kilmarnock is a great example of someone who's really helped lots of people in terms of their own journeys to deliver projects at stations. So I'd really endorse that.
Yeah, one thing I would mention that's happening in Scotland is that we're moving away. We've finished off with Station Community Regeneration Fund. That was a fund that we used to bring all these old buildings back into use. We're moving away from that. We're bringing in a heritage fund, where we're going to be looking at heritage sort of structures, and that'll take into account structures that are out with the footprint of ScotRail. So the likes of viaducts, bridges, canals, tunnels, footbridges and things like that are out with the scope of ScotRail. We'll be looking to try and bring them back into use for community groups and things like that. It's a totally different funding stream. We're just waiting on the Scottish Government saying, yeah, okay, you can spend the money. But as you know, purses are shut just now, so there's no money getting spent.
Indeed. I'm going to move on. Warren from Cumbria.
Okay. Good morning, guys. So yeah, two questions. The first one for Rob, really. Rob, so the picture you showed on the right hand side was Millham Station, which we're having all sorts of problems engaging with the Arch Company, both the trustees and the CRP. And I was just wondering if you got any advice on how that, how we could, make life a bit easier for ourselves. We just seem to be hitting a brick wall at the moment, which is, very frustrating for certainly the trustees down at the station.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, and not to point at Archco, but we have similar challenges when we're looking to inspect and maintain our own assets that are within an Archco demise sometimes, and I think it's just the way that they're perhaps focused at times. With Millum, yes, we do need to engage with Archco, and we can help with that, but they are a separate commercial entity. They have a 150-year lease, so there are limited leverages that we can do. However, I have been specifically on Millum. I'll pick it up with you separately because we have had some dialogue behind the scenes, so perhaps need to keep you abreast of that in order to move that particular one along with Archco and come to a solution that unlocks their concern, but also allows the issues at Millum to hopefully, or some of them anyway, to be resolved.
Okay, that sounds promising, Rob. So yeah, I appreciate a conversation
Warren,
outside of.
before you go on, there was a forest of hands that come up from the committee. I think Dan's next. I think this will be about Archco, I suspect.
No, it won't actually. I was just going to remind you that we've got a couple of questions on the questions and answer text box. So please come back to me when you're ready to take the written questions.
Will do. Tim?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we as I say, we deal a lot with Archco. I mean, I'm not here to make excuses for them, but I think they are at the start of their journey. I think they're starting to resource up, and their resources to engage, I think, are limited. Now, I'd be very happy to help if you want to drop me an email about the particular issues. We have quarterly updates with Archco where we set out all the projects where we're working with them on, and we work with a guy called Rob McAuliffe at Archco, so I'm very happy to raise this particular one and see if we can just get a bit of traction.
Great, thanks, Tim. Barbara?
Yeah, question for Rob. Bishopstone Station is a coastal railway, as you probably know anyway, and with that comes some very vicious weather at times. We have an iron bridge that goes over from the building to the platform. This needs to be restored in our opinion. It did used to have windows. When it had windows, it stopped all this driving rain that came through, which obviously is going to upset the fabric of the building, because with the water we get in there, the water ingress we get in there is rather a lot, especially recently. I did ask if we could have some automatic doors going from the community hub area to the bridge when it's like that, and the answer I got was probably not, because you have to take out a contract. A Network Rail would have to take out a contract on this. What we would really love to do is to get this bridge restored back to its Art Deco, its olden days glory, and that would then protect the building, because we're having an awful lot of work. We have had, and we are going to have a lot more work done to this station building, and but having this bridge open to the elements like this is not going to do it any good. And I just wondered, where would we start?
Is that a lease? Is that a bridge? Presumably it's not part of the demise to the group. Is that a bridge that's Network Rail asset that crosses the line, for example?
It's not our asset.
Yes, so it's probably a Network Rail asset. Best place to start, I think, would be the sponsor within that route. So I'll pop you in touch, Barbara, with them, and then we can see what can be done with the asset engineer that is responsible for that bridge in terms of what they will and won't allow. So I think between those two contacts, that's where the decision will, or the go or no go will be able to be given in principle, I think. How and who pays for it, etc., will follow from.
If we knew we could get the bridge restored, I think then we can go out to funding. But until we know we can actually do it, there's no point going out to funding.
No, you're right. I think that's that. Talk to the right people. I'll because it's in the northwest. I should be able to find out who they are. Pop you in touch with those guys, and then you've got that go or no go decision, and then we can look to that next step.
Okay, thank you.
It is confusing even internally, about who's responsible for
Very
what,
much so.
But that's where your local contacts are really key wherever you are in the country. So drop me a note afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Brian.
Yeah, I was just going to go on. Yeah.
Kate Howie's been waiting quite a long time with a hand up.
She has. Yes, I was going to go to Dan next, but let's go to Kate. Hello, Kate, up in Scotland. Hello.
Hello,
There we go.
can
Hi,
you hear
Kate.
me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, hello everyone from sunny Scotland. Well, actually, it's not quite so sunny today. I would just like to say that I agree with Tim. It's not all rosy, I'm afraid, Julie, in Scotland. We do have many of our buildings which we have had various, not quite so much help from ScotRail as we would have wanted. My question is really for Rob, if I may. On our line, it's the Highland Main Line from Perth up to Inverness, a beautiful line, but most of the buildings on the line are listed. And because of various improvements on the line, particularly stations such as Dunkeld, etc., and some of their signal boxes are now in disuse. A lot of it is deteriorating so badly, and we're really concerned about that because we'll be really nearly overwhelmed by trying to get these buildings back into some sort of use or reasonable condition. Is there any way you can guide us towards someone who we could talk to about this?
Yes, again, I can give you the starting point. I feel like the fundamental issues that we encounter internally when it comes to sort of expanding our portfolio of what will be basically a let property will still be the same. We'll still come up with the same kind of challenges that I was trying to allude to earlier. I don't mean to sound negative or daunting, by the way, but I'm just trying to be honest about them. But that's where, if we can make it internally a little bit easier to let things, we can think a little bit more strategically about this. What can be like a quite high value of assets or liabilities, however you want to look at it, and then do something more strategic about them, as opposed to tackling things on a piecemeal basis, which is very time consuming. So in terms of contact, I don't know Scotland that well, but I've got a couple of people that I know that could give it some thought as to what the response would be. I think having it looked at from the root business level again is quite key, because they want, if you put it in that context, that's a relatively large problem potentially, and that's how to perhaps sell the issue and get the right buy-in from the start, so that someone will do something about it with you.
Great. I'm just going to we're running short of time, but I'm going to quickly go over to Dan, who's got a couple of questions on the question and answer thing.
I have, and having had a look at them, I'm not sure whether we can answer them directly today, but if we can, so much the better. If we can't, I do promise that one of us will get back to you at some point. So Judy mentions the Transport for Greater Manchester scheme to put some stations back into community use, but does say that they have had some of the same problems as has been discussed today, and that the community itself hasn't had as much of an input into that process as might be ideal. And I didn't know if either you or Martin might have any thoughts on the Transport for Greater Manchester work.
If those are the 4 stations that are funded as sort of shell and core condition, and I think communities have been invited to bid for their proposed use of the building. That's a really interesting model, by the way. And yes, I heard similar. There's some changes that would have been better internally, and I think those are still underway. If it is that project, it's an interesting model where I think it's either LCR or Network Rail or Northern funded the enhancement of that asset out of a particular pot from somewhere, and then the community group or local social enterprise walks in and then can do the fit out themselves. And all of those applications, I think, were assessed on sort of the merits of their sustainability and their business plan for each model. But is it those schemes? In which case, it'd be good to hear what the feedback is as well.
Yeah, it would have been those ones, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And just another question from Sarah, which Tim has given an answer to in the text box, but I think raises an interesting question that's probably just worth sort of airing anyway, which is, what do you do if you are one of our members who are interested in a heritage asset at the railway station that has no commercial or community potential use? So, for instance, Sarah's suggestion is a listed footbridge. Clearly, you can't rent that out for use as a meeting room or use as a business. So, how do you engage, I guess, with Network Rail on sort of repairing, restoring, refurbishing heritage assets that that have neither a community nor commercial use, but which are still important to the character of the station and the local community?
Can I just dip in there, Dan? I've obviously answered the question, but the point is that if this footbridge is in active use by passengers, then it should be being maintained. So, you know, it's not something is a community use or it's not a community use. A footbridge is every bit as part of an important part of the use of the community of that railway station as, let's say, a community route. So, you know, I think it's absolutely key in terms of, you know, how do we ensure, or how does Network Rail ensure that adequate maintenance is being undertaken on its historic structures, which I think is quite, you know, you could probably do a whole webinar on that, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a wider point there as well, as, you know, beyond footbridges, there are other things which are maybe not necessarily in active use by passengers, but which are historic features of the station, but which have no obvious business case either for community or commercial reuse that I hadn't really thought about. So I'm going to go away and have a think about that now.
Great, thanks, Dan. I cut Warren short. Warren said he had 2 questions. So to go back to him for the last one before the break. Perhaps Warren's.
No, I think we're done,
Yeah.
Brian, there,
Oh.
and I think we probably need to
Okay.
leave it there for break anyway.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good. In that case, we're a minute or so early. Absolutely fine. If we could get back here by
for the Tyne Valley Community Rail Partnership. The Tyne Valley line runs between Newcastle and Carlisle, and it's just a few miles south of the World Heritage Site of Hadrian's Wall. At Holtwhistle Station, we have 2 wooden buildings, one on each platform. These date from 1907. They were built in modular form, and the doors and windows were blocked and unblocked as required over time. For the last 50 years or so, about half of each building has been boarded up, with the other half being used as waiting rooms. The buildings were shabby, they were uninviting, unloved, and commercially they held no value to Network Rail or the train operating company. To give an idea of the scale, the Platform 1 building at the top here covers an area of 60 square metres, and the Platform 2 building 82 square metres. So why did we embark upon this project? Well, community rail partnerships have a remit from the DFT to bring redundant railway buildings back into use. We thought we could create 4 offices for small or startup businesses or artists, and we could vastly improve the waiting rooms. And we wanted to reflect the fact that Holtwhistle is a gateway to the World Heritage Site of Hadrian's Wall, which is a mere 3 miles to the north. Holtwhistle itself also has a rich history of its own, including being the town with the most surviving Bassel houses, having industrial, railway and ecclesiastical heritage, as well as 20th century gems. And that's not to mention the geology and the landscape attributes around here. We also wanted to re-engage the community with their station, promote the much improved service that we'd fought for, grow the tourism offer, the volunteer offer, and contribute to the sustainability of TVCRP, and altogether help the economic development of the area. The photos on this slide, this is the top 2 parts here, showing part of the boarded up area in the Platform 2 building. And this was what half of one of the waiting rooms looked like. Not very nice, not very inviting. So the project itself. We began at the end of April 2018. Actually, when I was preparing this presentation, I was frankly amazed at what we'd achieved in the first 7 months, as detailed on this slide. By Christmas 2018, we had a design, planning permission, funding for all the pre-contract requirements and the necessary utility, asbestos, BAT, condition surveys, and we even had contractors' prices and had secured almost half the funding for the works. Unfortunately, at the time, I was not keeping a log of my volunteer hours, so I've no idea of the time that I spent on the project. Other than I can say that since 2021, I have been noting it down, and I did about 400 hours in 2021 on this project, and it's more than 200 so far this year. However, I did start a diary on day one. Now that amounts now to more than 30 pages. I've kept it going, and it's been incredibly useful. And it's something I definitely recommend that you do, along with taking loads and loads and loads and loads of photographs, things that you don't think that you're going to need to take photographs of, like when they're putting down, you know, there's a hole, or when they're putting down some paving slabs, because I was asked, what is underneath the paving slabs? And I could go back to my photos and find actually what was underneath the paving slabs. That's because they'd been laid the wrong way around and had to come up again and be turned around 90 degrees. So well worth taking as many photographs as you can and keeping that diary. The next 2 years, so early 2019, saw our architect, who was a German national, who'd worked in the UK for 17 years, return to Germany amid Brexit uncertainties. He helped us secure the services of another architect, but it wasn't easy. And with hindsight, his leaving has been detrimental to the project. As you can see, progress throughout 2019 was slow, and we began our wading through treacle with a large amount of time being spent on failed funding bids. Basically, it's not worth chasing public money, such as, at the time, European funds or lottery funds. They run on an entirely parallel track to the railway. An example of this will actually be to do with the leases, Network Rail leases. They contain a clause that says if Network Rail needs to close a railway station for whatever reason, then they will. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, that's absolutely fine. If they've got a reason to close it, then that's fine. But that is not acceptable. It's not an acceptable clause in a lease if you're receiving public funds. So it's just a complete no-no, no negotiation, nothing. So that rules that one out. VAT was another can of worms. TVCRP is not VAT registered, and we did pay for expert advice as to whether we should become VAT registered for this project, and we were told no. We couldn't have raised a further 20%, and I certainly didn't want to, because that was about £100,000 just to pay the VAT. And that just seemed totally ludicrous. You know, these are owned by Network Rail. It's owned by us, the taxpayer, in effect. And why are we going to raise money to pay VAT? It's just nuts. So what we needed was the train operating company to hold the contract with the contractors and for them to offset the VAT. However, as you might imagine, it was not as simple as that. And if anyone wants to know more, I can share those details at another time. 2020 saw more frustrations and delays, and none of this was COVID related. Contractors could work throughout COVID. This project in no way has been affected by COVID. Basically, no one seemed to be getting on with the job. Project management was virtually non-existent. Finally, on the 21st September 2020, work began on site. Now, virtually all of the workers who came to site were subcontractors to the main contractor. Nearly all were competent in their own field, but there was a wide variety of experience, and they travelled from all over the country. As you know, we're virtually at Hadrian's Wall, up on the just under the Scottish border. And some of our contractors came from Hayling Island, which is about the furthest that you could get away from us. TVCRP did provide contacts with local tradesmen when we were asked by the site supervisor. With hindsight, the use of local tradesmen is something that should have been set up at the contract stage, especially in terms of when they were paid. This proved an absolute nightmare for small local businesses because the main contractor didn't pay them for months after the invoices were submitted. And basically it took us constantly pursuing the main contractor and to get them to pay up. the odd person they paid and the odd invoice was done straight away, but an awful lot of them for £700, which was really important to a local joiner, and they just didn't pay. They did in the end, but it was about 5 months down the line. So let's have a look at some of the work. We started on platform 2. And despite the surveys that we'd had done before in the pre-contract phase to see what the state of things were, once the interiors were cleared out, more extensive rot was found, which led to the whole of the floor and the joist being renewed on platform 1 and a section on the platform 2 building. It seemed that we picked the place on the platform 1 building where 5 joists had been replaced, and we made the wrong assumption in terms of the condition of them. Fortunately, Network Rail stepped up with some extra funding for that all to be replaced, since it is their building. The roof on platform 2 was removed and replaced. We were able to reuse most of the tiles, so that was good. An end wall had to be replaced, and all the corner posts of both buildings and the base plates around the bottom of the buildings all had to be replaced, and the buildings re-leveled because they were out of kilter. PV panels were installed on both roofs, and whilst the waiting rooms were not insulated, the studios needed insulation in the walls, the floors and the ceilings to conform to building regulations. And outside on platform 2, new stepped and ramped access was required. And here's one of the pictures showing what was underneath the slabs, which ended up being very useful. Internally, platform 2 has a chimney, and that was plastered, in fact, twice, but that's another story. Ceilings were plasterboarded and internal walls clad with wood of the same style as the original. And the new access was created on platform 2 because we moved it. There was a door, but it was boarded up in the modular form, and we moved the access to the end rather than having it on the sides. Painting was done. The painting is all red and cream, and that's because those are the heritage colours and the colours that Network Rail do along the line for all the bridges and their structures. So we thought it sensible to do the same. Kitchen areas were installed in each of the 4 studios. The floors were laid. This building, the platform 2 building, at the back, we wanted to put some security on the windows for the studios. So locally we had some bars designed and made by a young lady, in fact, who did it all. Super job. The canopy was erected, the light fittings put up. They weren't connected, we've only actually just got power. The outside was painted, and the accessible toilet, which is between the 2 studios, not quite complete in that photo, but getting there. A year on, and finally work begins on platform 1, much the same as platform 2. We had no contingency in this project in terms of cost, and instead what we did is phase the work so that we could reduce the scope of platform 1 work if necessary. There was a fixed amount of money that we'd raised, and that was it. That was all that could be spent. We decided to do platform 2 building first because it was more remote and it was the larger of the 2 buildings. I'm pleased to say we didn't have to reduce the scope too much at all, and we've been able to do what we wanted. So we had a birthday party 1 year on, and here's some of the contractors with the cake. Now I must also mention cake, make cake. Every time I went to site, I took cake, homemade cake, because keep everybody happy, and then you get things done. So make cake, and that was the birthday cake. Here we have the platform 1 building at various stages, the finished one down below. And I just had to include detail here. This is the toilet window. And this is a photograph of the station back in the 1960s. And basically, I just found it on the internet, went to a company on the internet again, and got a film made, which the contractors stuck onto the window for me. Cost of £18.27, an absolute bargain, and certainly compared to the more than £500,000 for the whole project. So I'm very proud of that one, and it just finishing touches. So think about stuff like that, because that's really important. March 2022, and we opened the Platform 1 waiting room, complete with a poster exhibition from our Halt Whistle is Something Special volunteers, who'd been planning this since before we started this project. So it was great for them to be able to get their first exhibition up. We added security to the windows and the door between the waiting room and the studios on Platform 2. Again, designed and made locally by the same lady. This was the design inspired by Hadrian's Wall. And then to finish off, we installed blackout blinds with photos of the station in days gone by to all the windows of the studios. And I've tried to match it such that that's the picture you would see out of that window in days gone by. And this one's actually 3 meters wide. So I'm really, really pleased with those. And just to add that all of those touches, the toilet window photo, the blinds and the metalwork, was all in our control of TVCRP and paid for by us. We'd got, we were using our funding to do that. It was nothing to do with the contractors. So where are we now? Well, power has just been installed to the studios. We still await a solution to the accessibility issue to all the studios and the Platform 2 waiting room. And we can but hope that completion will be in early 2023. But since this was scheduled to be a 5-month job, and we're now more than 2 years later, I'm not holding my breath. Okay, so what have the challenges been? Well, the project was conceived and driven by the Tyne Valley Community Rail Partnership. We secured the funding, the majority of which was paid directly to the train operating company, with about 100,000 coming through TVCRP, which incidentally we still have because nobody's asked us for it yet. And we'll keep hold of it until somebody does. However, the contract for delivery was between the train operating company and the contractor. So legally, TVCRP had no role in the delivery and no right to influence any part of the work. Hence, it was and still is very difficult to progress issues. As Barbara said in hers, we rely on our passion, our knowledge, our tenacity, our humour, our positive approach, and the fact that we're all volunteers. If I'd been being paid to do this job, I'd have given up some years ago. And that's what basically gets us through. Most of the time, no one was taking responsibility for getting the job done other than TVCRP. And we had little or no control over the process. There was lack of site management by the contractor, lack of project management by the contractor. Lack is being generous, I would say, non-existent project management by the contractor, and lack of project management by the train operating company. And this led to many delays, errors, and mistakes. I could give you a few examples. Network Rail contractors damaged the new water pipe that goes to Platform 2 when they were doing some drainage work. So this is totally nothing to do with our project whatsoever, doing some drainage work by the track. They damaged the water pipe. And it took 4 months and the intervention of our local MP, not once but twice, before responsibility was taken and the repairs were carried out. 4 months. Nobody was listening to us. Nobody was trying to get the right person in Network Rail, trying to get it sorted, trying to get Northern to do something about it. No, it just didn't happen. pleased to say it finally did, but the windows and doors on the Platform 2 building were all refurbished by a local joiner to a high standard. He quoted for the Platform 1 work, but instead the contractor chose to have new windows made elsewhere, in Derby, in fact. These windows were delivered to site and rejected not once, but twice. The first time they were the wrong design, and the second time they were poorly constructed, having been glued and screwed using 2x3 timber and few, if any, joints. Luckily, they were sent straight to the local painter's workshop so he could do the painting on them. He alerted me to their condition. He got 2 local joiners along. I went along, and the joiners gave me details of all the errors and said they could not even be amended to be acceptable. The third set were delivered and again carefully scrutinised. These were deemed to be just about acceptable, but at a snagging meeting last week, we found water ingress in one of the frames, so perhaps not as good. Beware 2 steps. Part of the accessibility issues we have are to do with the 2 steps leading to the Platform 2 waiting room. Despite the contractors putting them in, they had not been signed off by Network Rail, whose guidance states that there should be 1 step or 3, but not 2. Here are the offending steps. Next to the mosaic of Hadrian that we put in, welcoming visitors to Holtwhistle. That came out of one of our local factories that was being pulled down, and we've had it mounted and a welcome to Holtwhistle written around it. The Platform 2 waiting room is also to be dressed as a welcome to the World Heritage Site, and we've just secured some funding for that. But we don't know what's going to happen with these 2 steps. This is a 1907 building. I'm trying very hard to get the powers that be to say, you know, we've done our best here. We've got a ramp, we've got 2 steps. I've even suggested that we put a 3rd step on top and a 1 step down, because that would fulfill the requirements. But nobody will actually take responsibility for the safety case, neither Network Rail or Northern. And if someone in the future trips because you know, the guidance is you shouldn't have 2 steps, then they won't take ownership of the safety case. So my MP is about to get another letter on this. There are many stories to be told about the project, but I think my time's up. So I'll end by saying, yes, I would do it all again. Despite the frustrations, I have enjoyed it. I've learned so much that it would be a shame not to use the knowledge again. And I am very, very willing, if you've got questions further down the line, if you want to come and visit Holtwhistle, if you want me to talk to your group or anything about the experiences, I'm very, very happy to pass it all on, and things that we might do differently in the future and where some of the issues are. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. And yeah, I've sort of followed this project all the way through from the beginning as well for Community Rail Network. And yeah, I mean, there's more stories than that.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There's quite a few. Right, we've got plenty of time for questions at the moment. Has anyone got any questions? If you want to raise your hand. Dan, is there anyone in the Q&A?
Oh, yes. I've got one that's very close to my heart as well.
Off you go.
From Sally, who asks if there is a specific Network Rail policy relating to salt storage inside listed or indeed non-listed station buildings, and also the use of corrosive salt on metal footbridges. I don't know if Rob's still with us. I hope he is. But it's one, yeah, it's close to my heart, because every time we do a community station reuse of a redundant space on my patch, we go in and discover there's a whole load of salt bags in there. They've all been drawing in moisture for the last 5 years, and the floorboards have rotted every single time. So it would be nice to know if there was a policy.
Indeed it would, Dan. It's probably very typical of the kind of detailed question that I'm faced with now. I have absolutely no idea, to be completely honest, and I'm racking my brain to think who on earth would know. I think that the two people that would know may be either the asset protection team, I think actually would be your first port of call, because they oversee a lot of the works, and they might know. In fact, Julie, actually be interested to know what your experience was with who was giving you, who was telling you what that policy was. I mean, that's a fascinating, if infuriating example. I love to add an extra step comment. That I think would be the first port of call. But can I ask you, Julie, where that sort of enforcement of, well, no, these are the rules and you've got to stick with them. Who did that come from? What
Charlie Hull. I don't know whether you know Charlie Hull. He's civils, and he's they call. I'm just trying to think of his official title. It's compliance. He's the compliance man for Network Rail's civils.
Okay.
Things. So he's a very nice man. I've got nothing against Charlie. He's one of the few people at Network Rail that always get back to me when I email him, even when he's on holiday. And he will respond, even if he can't help you and he needs to pass it on. He's a great guy, so I've nothing against him. But that is the guidance, and that's what I'm being told. So
okay, well, I imagine it's similar. So it will be the engineer that we're working with in that particular area, and the asset protection teams. And it often comes back to getting the right, knowing who your contacts are, who your stakeholders are. And even for me in Network Rail, it is very difficult to know who to talk to in different routes and different areas and different parts of the business. But yeah, do drop me a line on that, and I'll try and find out if I can anymore. If I can find the right contact, then yeah, drop me a note.
Yeah, just getting back to salt a moment, there is a called salt substitute. Northern were using it for a while. It's called magic ice melt. There's one snag with it: it's not magic and it don't melt ice. So be careful what you wish for when it comes to winterization. Right, Stephen Booth, Purbeck CRP, you have a question. Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. No, just to say to Barbara and to Julie, brilliant, for the perseverance and for the efforts you've made. And it just goes to show what can be done. I know it's time, and I know the stakeholder engagement and all the processes you go through are very, very difficult, because Network Rail, our processes are difficult. I've got experience myself with that in CCIF projects and things like that. But what I wanted to ask you, Barbara, is, you've done this wonderful job on the station. How is it going to be managed for the community use you've identified? You've engaged all the community. Who's going to manage that process as it's being used going forward?
You're talking about at the community room, because that's basically what we've signed up for at the moment.
Yeah, the community room, the space that you're going to use. Yeah,
we will be running it as a group, and it'd be my responsibility as chair initially. But we are all taking different parts. There's 3 key holders. We had an alarm system fitted, and there's 3 key holders, and we will all take our turn in doing things. But basically, it's being run by me.
So it's effectively been run by the Friends, volunteers, station
operators. It's going to be run by the Friends of Bishopstone Station.
Great. Yeah. Is that the same intention for you, Julie, with your space?
We are taking a lease when they get finished from the train operating company, because the train operating company have the lease from Network Rail for the whole building. We are taking a section of that lease that covers the studios, and only the studios. The electricity supply actually has been separated out from the waiting rooms and the studios, not for our convenience, but because there wasn't enough power to have more than one socket. At one stage, they reduced me right down to one socket in each studio. And I said, that's not fit for purpose. We got to sort this out. So we've got another power supply now. So yeah, we would just be leasing the studio areas at a peppercorn rent from the train operating company. One of our issues coming up now is the fact that the train operating company, it's not the franchise anymore because it was handed back, so it's directly operated by the DFT. But we've only got another year or so before that runs out, so they can't give us a lease beyond 2024, I know it's 2024, 2025. So all the time this has been going on, the length of lease that we will have has been shortening, and they say we've still got to pay all the solicitors' fees, etc., that we've already paid for the lease when we get it now. We're going to have to pay again when we get to the end of the process, yet nothing will have changed in a sense. So we are battling all that sort of thing, because we and quite right with I think it was Barbara that said leases, read it, take it back, argue it, because even though we've made it clear right from the start that we were going to rent these out at the commercial rate for Holt Whistle to make enough money to help maintain the buildings, but also to put into TVCRP projects, still that doesn't get passed on down to the loops and to the solicitors, and then they still come back say, no, it's community use only. And we say, no, we're not using this for the community. We're not giving it, we want it free from you, but actually we need money to be able to maintain these buildings and do things. And it's just gone back and forward to land agents and solicitors and all the rest of it. So yeah, we're still not there, but we'll get there.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, that, and it's a conversation I have with quite a few projects, in that even if it's a community project, you do need to raise enough money, either through, you know, selling teddy bear books or leasing out to small businesses to actually maintain the building. And these old buildings cost some money, even when they've been refurbished, as we've discovered with our water tower at Huddersfield, which is undergoing a huge amount of work, or will have to undergo a huge amount of work. And yeah, you have to find the wherewithal to do that. So I find it disappointing that Northern don't quite grasp, or Northern's property people don't quite grasp it. That's quite disappointing. You make an interesting point about the ongoing National Rail contracts as well. I've not actually thought about that. If you haven't actually already got a lease, that's a problem, isn't it? Well, right, we'll raise that, because that's bonkers, frankly. And it's also one of the reasons why you'd have, and I suspect this is what Barbara's going to say in a minute, you'd have a tripartite lease, because Network Rail will, yeah, they are
tripartite leases, which again makes it awkward. Fortunately, because part of the building is in Northern's using it, the waiting rooms, we won't have a full repairing lease. It will only be internal, but that's because it's a shared space.
Indeed. Barbara.
Yeah, getting back to the lease, we had our lease. It's a tripartite lease. It's between Network Rail, it's between us, and it's between the GTR at the moment. But it's also written into that lease, or whoever may take on the franchise in the future. And that was written into our lease. I don't know if that helps you at all, but that was written into our lease. Yours sounds a little bit different, I have to say.
Well, thank you. We can certainly try for that. I'll try for anything, basically.
Yeah, I agree. I think that certainly needs looking at, because that's the whole point of having tripartite leases, in that Network Rail were permanent. Hopefully the community group were permanent, but the train operator never was. Who knows what GBR is going to bring now with that, but that's certainly the thing I would aim for.
I agree with that, Brian. I think it is odd, the situation you're describing, Julie, that yes, your term should notwithstand whoever is the franchise operator at the time. So yeah, do challenge that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's because Northern can't give it, I assume, and they're the one that have got the, they're one of the parties in the lease.
But I think you might need to get hold of the station portfolio surveyor from Network Rail's perspective there, who perhaps has a bit more control over that 10-year term that you seek.
Right, thank you.
That's great. Any more questions, Dan?
Not on the chat, but a quick plug, if it's okay from me, for some resources that support and development team here at Community Rail Network are developing. So we should have relatively soon our handy guide of things to think about before you take on a community station reuse project. So that's before you even start talking to any train operators or Network Rail. Is your things to think about that you might not have even thought about, that you might need to think about. And our other offer, of course, is that if you contact your local support and development team contact, we will happily come out and look with you at a station building, especially if you can get your train operator to get us into it, and give you some thoughts, suggestions, things that have worked elsewhere, obvious problems that we've come across in other places that we can spot for you straight away.
Yes, and I should add that several of both of your projects feature in this list. In your case, Julie, it's bats. We do mention bats and flying rats as well, because I don't think you've had them, but some people have. So yeah, we're quite pleased with this list, and we will share that with everybody, as Dan says. I also need to plug our next webinar, which is on the 6th of December and is connecting and empowering our diverse communities. So it's on the 6th of December. You can book in the normal way. I think Hazel's probably popped up a link. Yes, she has, to that. So you can click on straight on there to join that if you wish, or you can go through the website. I have to remind you about our training bursaries. If you've really enjoyed the training today, and of course it's been free, because that's what we like to do at Community Rail Network. But if you've got training outside or away from us that needs a fee, we do have, through our training department, training development managers, a training bursary. You can apply for that. You can have one a year, I think it is. It is underspent at the moment. We want to hold on to it, so we're keen to get as many training bursaries out there. So please consider that if you'd like a little bit of brass to go and do some training. We also have coming up our Station Doctors Forum. We're having an online get-together of our Station Doctor members. So if you're not signed up to that and like to come, again, you can book that through the website. What else have I got on the list? One final thing, or two final things. Feedback survey. I believe when this webcast finishes, a link will pop up and feedback form will appear, and we'd love you to fill that in, please.
No, it won't, Brian. Sorry, it's change of plan. It's a link in the chat, but also afterwards I will email the details out to everybody that's attended today. And can I just give an apology? When Barbara's presentation was on, unfortunately, I was so focused on screen sharing, I didn't click record. So we haven't got Barbara's presentation recorded, but the actual presentation itself will be available, and Barbara's available for questions as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hazel. And we're just going back to midday. Right, all it is for me to say is thank you to Hazel and Dan for backing me up on this. It's much appreciated. Thank you to our speakers, to Rob and Tim to start off with. We really appreciate you taking your time. It's very much appreciated, and I think from the number of questions Rob's had, I hope it's really been worth your while, my friend. And thank you to Barbara and Julie for fantastic presentations on these projects. So I'm really looking forward to going down to see Bishop Stones. Yeah, Holt Whistle I know a bit more about. So yeah, I'm looking forward to coming to the opening of that as well. So thank you so much for spending the time. If you found this really useful, please put that in the feedback. If you haven't found it really useful, don't bother. And we will see you next time. And thank you very much to everybody.